Every time you board a Boeing 787 Dreamliner, you're volunteering to be a test subject in Boeing's deadly experiment. A leaked confidential report just exposed the terrifying truth: airlines are desperately hiding from passengers. Would you still fly if you knew Boeing chose profits over your life? Because for years, Boeing pushed the 787 Dreamliner as the future of flying. And no doubt for a while, it lived up to the hype. Passengers raved about the quieter cabins, the cleaner air systems, and the kind of comfort that made even long flights feel less punishing. Boeing's marketing worked, and the Dreamliner quickly became more than just another plane. It became a symbol of trust between Boeing and airlines that were staking their future on it. But trust in aviation is fragile, and it doesn't take long for cracks to appear. What started as small, almost unnoticeable issues began to creep into flight operations. Pilots started reporting the autopilot shutting off mid-flight without any warning. Instrument panels would flicker like they were glitching, then suddenly reset as if nothing had happened. Entire power systems cut out and restarted with no explanation, leaving crews unsettled but without anything concrete to report. These were the kinds of faults that left no clear trace. Maintenance crews ran their checks and found nothing wrong. Diagnostics cleared the planes every single time, but nothing could prepare them for the confidential report that exposed the Dreamliner's darkest flaws. It was because of that strange inconsistency that the flight crews gave it a name: ghosts in the system. Problems that were real enough to rattle the people in the cockpit, but invisible to the teams trying to fix them on the ground. They were strange, unpredictable, and impossible to replicate. One day the aircraft would operate perfectly. The next, it would start misbehaving in ways that couldn't be explained. Boeing's jewel of modern aviation was supposed to inspire confidence, yet it was now earning a reputation for being haunted by issues no one could pin down. At first, these malfunctions seemed like annoyances more than anything else. An autopilot reset here, a flickering screen there. Frustrating, yes, but not something you'd call a crisis. Airlines and crews chalked them up as isolated quirks of a highly complex machine. And Boeing had built an image of being too advanced, too cutting edge, to be undermined by something as small as a software hiccup. But in aviation, the little things have a way of growing into bigger warnings. The more these glitches piled up, the harder they were to dismiss. A turning point came when a confidential document slipped into the highest office at Qatar Airways. The report didn't circulate through press conferences or glossy investor updates. It was passed straight to CEO Akbar Al-Baker, bypassing the usual public relations filters. Inside, the language was cold and technical, but the meaning was devastating. The Dreamliner, Boeing's prized 787, was not just suffering from scattered glitches or occasional misfires. And buried in those pages was a discovery so alarming it turned whispers of doubt into a full-blown crisis. The report pointed to structural bonding flaws in the fuselage, the kind of defects that could compromise the integrity of the aircraft over time. It listed sensor misalignments that risked feeding pilots inaccurate information in flight. And buried in the analysis was a chilling observation. Certain 787s had the potential to remain locked in ground mode even after takeoff. In aviation, that isn't a small oversight. It's a scenario that places both crew and passengers in a situation no airline can afford to gamble on. What made the report so damning was not only what it revealed, but how it revealed it. The issues described weren't isolated to one production batch, one subcontractor, or one corner of the assembly line. They were systemic, threaded through the aircraft's design and its quality control processes. Engineers inside Qatar Airways recognized immediately what that meant. A single glitch can be fixed. A recurring problem can be investigated. But a web of flaws running through multiple systems suggested something much darker, that the Dreamliner's problems were not accidents at all, but the result of decisions made at the very heart of Boeing's production model. This was no longer about troubleshooting. It was about trust in the machine itself. The reaction inside Qatar Airways was swift but carefully contained. There were no sweeping announcements or public clashes with Boeing. Instead, decisions were made behind closed doors, with instructions that rippled through the airline's operations without ever breaking the surface for passengers to see. And from that moment on, Qatar Airways began quietly dismantling its Dreamliner fleet behind the scenes. Dreamliners began vanishing from service rosters. They weren't sent in for maintenance cycles with the promise of returning. They were pulled outright. Some were ferried quietly into long-term storage facilities, where aircraft are parked indefinitely under desert sun and monitored for decay. Others were discreetly placed on the secondary market, listed for sale with little fanfare. It wasn't just the aircraft being moved. Entire schedules were being rewritten. Routes that had been built around the 787's range and efficiency suddenly needed different aircraft. Wide bodies like the A350 and older 777s were reshuffled to cover long-haul corridors. Crew assignments were torn up and redrawn. Flight planners began treating the absence of Dreamliners not as a short-term inconvenience, but as a permanent reality. It was crisis management disguised as routine adjustment. Externally, passengers might only have noticed small disruptions, a canceled flight here, an equipment swap there, maybe longer wait times or unusual aircraft substitutions. But inside the airline, the magnitude of the shift was obvious. A fleet once called the backbone of Qatar Airways international operations was being amputated in silence. For an airline that had staked so much of its identity on being ahead of the curve, the decision to retreat from Boeing's showcase plane wasn't just a logistical move. It was a calculated act of survival. But the most shocking part was how Qatar managed to keep this silent exodus completely hidden from the public eye. And the silence was strategic. Qatar Airways did not issue press releases condemning Boeing, nor did it seek to make headlines with its internal doubts. Publicly, the airline maintained the image of normalcy. Privately, executives knew they were dismantling a cornerstone of their business. The decision to keep this quiet was as much about protecting passengers' confidence as it was about shielding the airline's own reputation. Admitting openly that the Dreamliner was no longer trusted would have triggered panic in booking systems, investor relations, and international partnerships. So the exit was done quietly, one aircraft at a time, under the radar of news cycles. When Qatar Airways engineers dug deeper into the recurring issues with their 787 fleet, they uncovered something more troubling than random faults. Internal memos, some dating back years, showed that Boeing had already seen versions of these problems long before Qatar raised the alarm. There were notes about structural shimming errors, where thin filler materials used to bridge gaps between components weren't properly applied, leading to potential stress points in the airframe. There were documented cases of torque calibration problems, with bolts and fasteners signed off without accurate tightening records. And there were repeated mentions of parts being installed without the proper verification procedures slipped through the system under the pressure of keeping the production line moving. None of this was new. It was history repeating itself, buried in technical paperwork and never meaningfully resolved. The Federal Aviation Administration had flagged similar concerns in audits over the years. Inspectors noted inconsistencies in quality control at Boeing's assembly plants, identifying both shimming flaws and calibration issues that could affect safety over time. Yet despite the warnings, nothing fundamental changed. But the real bombshell came when decades of warnings revealed Boeing had seen this nightmare coming all along. The audits generated reports. The reports generated corrective action plans, but the production numbers kept taking priority. Deadlines mattered more than fixes, and delivery schedules carried more weight than the hidden flaws of an aircraft that was supposed to represent the future of aviation. What looked like cutting-edge technology on the outside was, in reality, a patchwork held together by overlooked details and deferred accountability. Inside Qatar Airways, this knowledge shifted everything. Grounding the Dreamliners was no longer just about addressing glitches that crews couldn't explain. It was about realizing those glitches were the byproduct of systemic negligence. This wasn't bad luck. It was failure by design, shielded by paperwork and procedural checklists that gave the illusion of safety. And once the illusion cracked, operations at Qatar started to spiral. With entire sections of the Dreamliner fleet pulled from service, daily schedules fell apart. Long-haul flights that had been carefully planned months in advance suddenly disappeared from booking systems. Routes needed emergency reshuffling, forcing other aircraft like A350s and 777s to be stretched thin across multiple continents. And as Qatar scrambled to keep flights running, passengers began to feel the chaos creeping into their own travel plans. Passengers booked on those routes woke up to canceled flights, rebookings, and unexplained delays. The complaints poured into customer service, swamping call centers with angry travelers demanding answers that staff weren't authorized to give. To the public, it looked like poor planning. Inside the company, it was the visible fallout of a fleet collapsing from the inside. The strain spread to the flight crews. Pilots were already unsettled by what they'd seen in the cockpit. Autopilot systems disconnecting without cause, engines failing to respond properly during taxi, and cockpit indicators delivering false readings mid-flight. These weren't isolated stories anymore. They were repeating patterns across multiple aircraft. Even after extensive pre-flight checks cleared every system, Crews stepped into the cockpit wondering if the aircraft they were about to fly could be trusted. The unease was palpable, and no amount of official reassurance erased it. Engineers on the ground couldn't isolate the causes, and pilots in the air were left with a creeping sense that the Dreamliner wasn't just unreliable, it was unpredictable. The daily chaos inside Qatar Airways became routine. Schedulers rebuilt rosters almost hourly. Crews were reassigned mid-shift. Aircraft substitution became standard procedure rather than an exception. What had once been a model fleet strategy turned into a game of survival. It was no longer a fleet issue, it was a slow-motion collapse of confidence, both in the aircraft and in Boeing itself. And Qatar wasn't alone. Other airlines began to quietly mirror these actions, even if no one wanted to say it publicly. In Tokyo, Japan Airlines removed 2 Dreamliners from service after experiencing mid-flight power interruptions. The incidents weren't officially explained to passengers, but internally they echoed the same ghost issues Qatar had faced. In Frankfurt, Lufthansa logged repeated software inconsistencies that made little sense to their engineering teams. The problems didn't point to hardware failures, but to deeper flaws in the aircraft's systems. Across the Atlantic, American Airlines began phasing certain 787s off transatlantic routes without notice, replacing them with older aircraft that management knew could at least be trusted. And the haunting truth was clear. The Dreamliner's failures weren't accidents. They were built into the machine itself. Now here's the question nobody wants to face. Would you step on a plane if you knew its flaws were ignored just to meet a deadline? Tell me in the comments.